Thank you very much, Adam, for your excellent introduction. So to prevent embarrassing myself, I will just go Conatus driving in English in what follows. So let me start by saying that I'm extremely excited and happy to be here. I've learned a lot by talking to many of you in the past 2 days, and I'm happy that I can wrap up this visit by presenting my own work in front of all of you. Okay, I will today talk about Spinoza's theory of striving. And before I get to the main body of my talk, I will start by offering some big picture remarks. So for those of you who do not know Spinoza very well, this is what he probably looked like, and these are his days. As you can see, he did not live a very long life, but he still occupies a very important place in the history of philosophy. This is mostly because for many, he is the paragon of rationalism, some kind of philosophical superhero. And that assessment in part is fair because his masterwork, The Ethics, is written in the so-called geometrical order, an imitation of Euclid's elements. What that means is that presumably every doctrine contained in the Ethics, including metaphysics, philosophy of mind, psychology, and ethics itself, can be deduced from a few primitive principles which are knowable a priori. Accordingly, a common conception of how we should study Spinoza is that we should study ethics and Spinoza's works in a self-contained way and follow him along this road of pure inquiry. But I think we should be more open. In this talk, I will focus on one of the pivotal doctrines in the ethics, which says that everything has a striving for self-preservation. In particular, I will focus on one view within that doctrine, which says it is impossible for anything to kill itself or destroy itself. I will show that this view is based on a conception of the nature of an individual thing, which is informed by Spinoza's scientific and philosophical context. Therefore, in studying Spinoza, we should perhaps pay more attention to his context, where he got his ideas from, and that could be much more rewarding than it is usually assumed to be. So, in the first of the talk, I will explain the doctrine in more detail and mention two concerns associated with it, and which will get us to the discussion of suicide. So these are Spinoza's own words about the doctrine I mentioned. Each thing, as far as can by its own power, strives to persevere in its being. And in the very next proposition, Spinoza identifies that striving for self-preservation with the very essence of the thing. So everything essentially or necessarily strive for self-preservation. But one might find this doctrine somewhat strange because upon hearing it, there might be two immediate concerns. The first one is, it seems more natural to say that animals or human beings strive for self-preservation, but in what sense do objects like this table, for example, strive for self-preservation? Second, if it is true that everything necessarily strive for self-preservation, then what about the very common phenomenon of self-harm or suicide, where a thing does not seem to strive for self-preservation, but rather even self-destruction? I'll get back to these two concerns later, and now let's see how this doctrine is deployed in Spinoza's system. Because if this doctrine is idle, then it doesn't really matter if it does not make much sense. However, this doctrine is anything but idle. It is, in fact, the foundation of Spinoza's entire ethical theory. Since the striving for self-preservation constitutes the essence of everything, it constitutes the essence of human beings. And as the essence of human beings, it is the foundation first for Spinoza's theory of human nature, where Spinoza tries to derive every affect, which is his technical term for passion or emotion, from three primary affects, namely joy, sadness, and desire, which are either derivable or identical with the striving for self-preservation. Also, since presumably virtue or happiness constitutes some kind of realization or well-functioning of the human essence, the virtue and happiness in turn consist in the some kind of true preservation of one's own being. And this is Spinoza's theory of virtue. This is only a very quick and partial summary. And the main point is that the stakes are high here, right? Because if this doctrine is really the cornerstone of Spinoza's theorizing about the human life. And If this doctrine is not tenable, then all these subsequent theories turn out to be baseless, which is a disaster for a systematic philosopher like Spinoza. Perhaps that kind of the sense of strangeness about that doctrine of universal self-striving can be mitigated if we realize that Spinoza is actually in good company. So similar reflections on striving for self-preservation are commonly found in the history of philosophy. For example, in Antiquity, the Stoics argued that animals have a primary striving for self-preservation. And in the second text, you can see Seneca very eloquently propounds that animals have a primary attachment to itself, and the care of oneself is prior to everything else. The modern era is even more replenished with similar views. Hobbes certainly says human beings strive for self-preservation, who influences Locke, and Hume has Hobbes as a target, and Katie Abrahamson can tell us all about that. And Pascal and Laroche introduced the term self-love into the French vocabulary, and who in turn influenced Rousseau, and Rousseau has an influence on Kant, and David Sussman can also tell us about that. And even later, Nietzsche was influenced by Laroche. So the list goes on and on. But when we compare Spinoza's doctrine of universal striving with what these other philosophers say, then the kind of strangeness becomes even greater, because Spinoza goes far further than all of them, in precisely the two respects relating to the two concerns I have just voiced. So Spinoza ascribes the striving for self-preservation to all beings whatsoever. So it's perfectly universal, while other philosophers say only animals or human beings strive for self-preservation. And Spinoza would say the striving for self-preservation is essential to the thing, or even it constitutes the very essence of a thing, while the other philosophers are more or less satisfied with just saying, it is a general observation that most animals and most human beings strive for self-preservation most of the time, and they would not go as far as saying that it's absolutely essential. So in what follows, I will mostly focus on the second concern and the challenge brought by the case of suicide. And near the end of this talk, I will come back to the first concern. Now, if we think that it is possible that someone could kill oneself, then it means that it could happen that one would not strive for self-preservation, which violates the essentiality part. One of the most significant cases of suicide might be Seneca. We have seen how Seneca eloquently propounds the striving for self-preservation of animals, but he died exactly by his own hands. Though he was ordered to die by the tyrant Nero, Seneca thought that his death was voluntary, and involuntarily embracing his death, he was being virtuous, and also that act shows noble character. In fact, Seneca's suicide became some of a trope in later art history. So this is a painting by Huygens of Seneca's suicide. You can see his facial expression is really calm. With that calmness, supposedly shows his noble character. Of course, that picture is quite exaggerated because we know Seneca was quite weak and thin before he died, but that seems like he has to be working out ever before dying. Okay, but despite the positive aura surrounding Seneca's suicide, Spinoza offers an extremely harsh verdict on that, which verdict consists in 2 points. First, Seneca's death was not the case of suicide. The position that Seneca killed himself is wrong. Rather, he was killed by something else, by an external cause. Second, Seneca was not virtuous, but rather weak-minded in being concerned, allowing himself to be incurred by this external cause and failing to preserve himself. So Spinoza was holding on to the essentiality requirement, and his theory of virtue built upon that. Of course, Seneca meant his verdict to be universally applicable. He did not just mean to say that it was not the case that Seneca killed himself. What he meant to say was that for every act, it is impossible or it is not true that X killed itself. For that, Spinoza needs a stronger justification, and indeed he does have that justification in that very short proposition that is shown on the screen, and I will read it aloud because it will be focused on the rest of the talk. Proposition 4, this is in part 3 of ethics. No thing can be destroyed except through the external cause. And demonstration, this proposition is evident through itself. The definition of anything affirms and does not deny the thing's essence, or it posits the thing's essence and does not take it away. So while we attend only to the thing itself and not to external causes, we shall not be able to find anything in it which can destroy it. 3b. So this proposition is currently very important because it works. It solves that question about suicide once and for all. But despite its importance, it's very, very strange again. So first of all, it is very obscure. So what is the talk about definition about? What's role is supposed to play in that demonstration? And also it appears to be somewhat question begging because the whole demonstration seems to just be repeating what the proposition itself says in a more nuanced way. But despite these concerns, I would say that there is a more charitable reading to it. And I will provide an interpretation of this short proposition, showing that in fact it embodies a more sophisticated account. So here are the 4 main claims that make up my interpretation for some pretext. First claim is that the thing in E3P4 has a specific meaning. It refers to any composite individual made up of component parts united with each other. My second claim is that the essence of that composite individual consists in a fixed pattern of causal communications between its component parts, and conversely, the destruction of the thing consists in the disruption or discontinuation of that pattern rather than total annihilation. My third claim is that it's about the very obscure talk about definition. The definition of thing posits its essence insofar as it describes how the pattern is generated through interaction between component parts. My fourth claim is that the thing cannot destroy itself because this fixed pattern of causal communications is sustainable and stable and not self-disruptive. So I will now unpack and justify these claims one by one. The first claim, thing as composite individual. The subject matter of E3P4 is thing. So what does thing mean? Presumably, I am a thing, and the tiger, Zoya, that's scrolling in the Indianapolis Zoo is a thing. Yeah, I did some research on that beforehand. And the aggregate of me and Zoya tiger, does that qualify as a thing? I mean, it does. If it is a thing, then E3P4 is doomed because that aggregate by its nature seems to strive for self-destruction because Zoya tiger will probably prey on me as soon as it gets the chance, right? And so therefore that aggregate does not have a striving for self-preservation. So if Spinoza is not saying straightforward nonsense, there has to be some specific meaning for the thing. I think we can get some clarification by looking at the very next proposition, proposition 5. Things are of a contrary nature, i.e. cannot be in the same subject insofar as one can destroy the other. Demonstration, if they could agree with one another or be in the same subject at once, then there could be something in the same subject which would destroy it, which by P4 is absurd. Therefore, since etc. I have highlighted the key concepts here, and here is a diagram showing the interconnections between the concepts. In the proposition, contrariety is equated with the inability to be in the same subject, and mutual destruction can be taken to imply contrariety as in the material conditional. This can be seen from the proposition. I'm sorry. The proposition is essentially a reductive argument. It assumes for a reductive premise that two mutually destructive things can be in the same subject or agree with one another. So it in fact assumes the negation of that material conditional, the antecedent and negation of the consequent. And it derives the absurd consequence that that same subject which contains two mutually destructive things would destroy by itself or destroyed by something in it, which violates E3 P4. The reference to P4, which is our main focus here, is important because that shows if E3 P4 can be applied here, then thing in E3 P4 and subject in E3 P5 must have the same meaning. Otherwise, it cannot be applied here. So now the question becomes, what does subject mean? Now I will present then a prevalence interpretation on the market and provide an argument against it. So this discussion is quite technical. If you are not very familiar with Spinoza, you might not be able to follow it. But the key thing that I want you to remember is that there is another interpretation and it is wrong. Okay, so following Garrett's seminal paper, many commentators now think subject means subject of inherence. Inherence is a technical term from the Aristotelian tradition. For them, the world is made up of substances which exist independently of each other, which are the basic building blocks of the world, and there are properties, modes, or accidents inherent in them, which means that they cannot exist independently of the substance. So I am a substance, and my height or my skin color are properties or modes inherent in me. So that is the basic picture, and I will call their interpretation the inherence model. And the inherence model, according to the inherence model, the expression in the same subject being here in the same subject in the way that modes here in their substance. Now, an argument against that is the proper demonstration we have seen, P3, P5 demonstration cannot be made to work within Spinoza's metaphysics of substance. Let's see how that goes. Under the inherence model, proposition 5 means if two modes are mutually destructive, then they cannot inhere in the same subject. And the gist of that demonstration would be if two mutually destructive modes were to inhere in the same subject, then this subject will be destroyed by itself. So the thought here is that imagine two mutually destructive modes inhering in the same subject, and ultimately these two modes, one or both of them, would be destroyed, and that implies the destruction of the subject itself, while there's E3, P4. Of course, here's the important question. So why does the destruction of modes inhering the subject imply the destruction of the subject itself? Because normally we would think, if I become taller, I would not be destroyed, right? So if the destruction of a property of mine is destroyed, I could still exist. So this is quite an counterintuitive claim. But do they have any argument for that? In fact, there does have an ingenious argument for that. He argues that these modes are not accidental to the subject, rather they are properties necessarily implied or caused by the subject's essence. The technical term for that kind of modes are propria. So if the modes are propria, then it follows that if the subject exists, it necessarily follows that its propria will exist at the same time. And by modus tollens, if the propria are destroyed, the subject will thereby be destroyed as well. I think this argument, when viewed in isolation, makes much sense. And Spinoza does seem to say something like the modes are propria. But when we put that argument back into Spinoza's metaphysics, especially Spinoza's metaphysics about the divine substance, then there seems to be some kind of inconsistency. First, as Garrett himself agrees, all modes of God are necessarily caused by God itself. So all modes of God are God's propria. However, some of those modes, the finite modes, we do not need to understand what that means, but some of those modes are constantly being destroyed, And indeed, they are constantly being destroyed by God itself, because God is the cause of everything. But this destruction does not imply the destruction of God itself. So there is this inconsistency, but how do we explain it? I think the explanation is quite simple because for some propria, it is part of their nature to be generated and destroyed within the entire duration of the subject's existence. In other words, they do not accompany the subject's entire lifespan. They are, in a sense, temporary, and it is not the case that all propria always coexist with the subject. So the premise that modus tollens argument is wrong, and the demonstration of E3P5B does not go through. All right, so I hope you are still with me at this moment, and we're back at where we began, namely, what does subject mean? Because after all, despite the advantage about the inherence model, it is a very natural understanding and also very entrenched understanding in the Aristotelian tradition. What else would that mean? I think if we delve a little deeper into Spinoza's context, we can see there is indeed an alternative understanding. So a bit more about Spinoza's life. Spinoza grew up and was educated exclusively in the Jewish community in Amsterdam before he was excommunicated in 1656 at the age of 23. So unlike many of his contemporaries, he did not grow up reading scholastic philosophy. In fact, he had to learn Latin from scratch after he was excommunicated. So apparently he had a lot of catching up to do, and he had to do it fast. And because he was not young anymore, bearing in mind that people used to become scholars at a much younger age, presumably some of his friends were on the tenure track already, but he was still learning Latin. So he had to catch up. So he made the very natural decision of resorting to textbooks rather than complicated, nuanced primary literature. And these are two of the textbooks that he studied pretty closely. They are written by a guy named Franco Bergersteig, who was not a very original philosopher, but who wrote a series of bestseller textbooks. That's what we still remember him today for. His textbooks are written in lucid Latin, which of course appealed to Spinoza as a new student of Latin. And what do we find in them? Elaborate accounts of the passages containing those key concepts we've seen. This is what Bergersteig said about contraries or contrariety. Contraries destroy each other. One of the contraries is diminished by the touch or contact of another, and then is again restored when it is freed from its contrary. Therefore, contrary cannot be in the same subject. If we compare this passage with the proposition 5 we have just seen, the similarity between them is really striking. And Bergersteig connects the same group of concepts, although he does not explain their relations as clearly as Spinoza, and the arrows here are only meant to represent the order in which he presented them. But still, I think the evidence is pretty solid that combined with the fact that Spinoza did read this book. So the evidence is pretty solid that the conceptual scheme of P5 was inherited from Bergersteig. But that by itself still does not get us very far, because the meaning of subject in that passage in Bergersteig is still somewhat ambiguous. I think we can get more clarification when we see what Bergersteig says about another key concept in that E3P5 agreement. Here is what he says. Agreement pertains to unity. Agreement is not found in every unity, but only in the kind of unity which consists of composition. Agreement, to also say a few words about it, is the union of several things, or as if several things. So for Bergersteig, agreement is the union of a composite whole, component parts of a composite whole. And that might seem to be counterintuitive to you, but for a Latin reader, that's counterintuitive because convenientia literally means a convening or the coming together of things. So probably that's how Bergersteig was seeing things. And here is the whole picture that emerged from our little dive into Bergersteig. So Bergersteig does not specify the relationship between contrariety and agreement, but perhaps he thinks they are closely connected because he explains them in neighboring chapters, and it would not be unnatural for Spinoza to explicitly connect them by the relation of negation. And now if we compare the conceptual scheme of E3P5 and that we get from Bergerstein, first we can see it is clear that Spinoza inherits that scheme from Bergerstein. Second, even if Spinoza reorders some of the concepts, even explains their connections a bit more clearly, it is unlikely that Spinoza would radically change any of the meaning of any of the terms that Bergerstein has explained. By that I mean the concept of agreement. So I think it is very plausible that Spinoza agreement also means the ability to be united in the same whole as component parts, and consequently subject being in component whole. So that's the thing, E3P4. Now there's an important interpretive advantage of this because Spinoza does have a term reserved for this kind of composite whole, which he calls an individual. And he extensively explains the nature and essence of individual in the passage so-called the physical digression in part 2 of the ethics. And based on our little investigation on the background of Spinoza, the physical digression and the Conatus argument, including E3P4, can be connected. It's interesting to see that Garrett does hint toward that direction in one of his papers, but he ultimately decided to not go along this road because, partly perhaps because there was no explicit reference back to the physical digression in the Conatus argument. But as we have seen, in fact, Spinoza's use of that conceptual scheme, most notably the use of the notion of agreement, is an implicit reference back to the physical digression. All right, now I've finished arguing for perhaps the most important claim of my interpretation, and I will argue for the second claim, that is in the essence of an individual consists in a fixed pattern of causal communication part. This claim is in fact somewhat a consensus in Spinoza scholarship, partly thanks to the seminal paper of Convert and but I will still walk you through it. And here is what Spinoza says about the nature of an individual. It is somewhat complicated, but I've highlighted the key text there. The main point of this passage is that the nature or the principle of individuation of an individual is the union of its component parts, which union consists in a fixed pattern of communicating motions. Note here that Spinoza is talking about bodies and motions, and there are, as you might know, there are other kinds of things in Spinoza like minds. But this discussion can be generalized because for Spinoza, every kind of thing is causally parallel to each other. So minds are causally parallel to bodies. So I will refer to this more general principle of individuation, the principle of the fixed pattern of causal communications for the motions. And in a series of lemmas that follow the definition, of which I include one of them on the handouts, Spinoza explains that the essence or nature of an individual consists just in this fixed pattern of causal communications. So presumably an individual, its parts can be substituted by other things and it can be enlarged or even shrinked, but the same individual will still exist if that same pattern of causal communications exists. And conversely, the destruction of individual would be the disruption of the causal pattern of causal communications rather than annihilation, which is impossible Spinoza based on the PSR. That is, I will not get into that, but it is the denial of total annihilation was kind of a commonplace for early modern philosophy. Okay. So Based on what we have seen about the essence of an individual being a fixed pattern of causal communications, we can now begin to understand that obscure talk of definition in 334D. First, what does Spinoza say elsewhere about definition? Spinoza has a distinctive view about the nature of definition. He thinks that the definition of a thing should explain the essence of the thing by showing how the thing with that essence is generated through an efficient cause. Here I included two texts where Spinoza says the perfect definition should explain the efficient cause of the thing. On the handout, there are fuller passages where Spinoza uses an example of a circle, saying that the perfect definition of the circle explains how the circle is generated through the motion of its radius. So Spinoza thinks that definition should explain how the essence is generated. And that, along with the view about individual essence, fits perfectly with what Spinoza says in P4D about definition. Here's the passage for you to refresh a little bit of your memory. And first, the thing's essence we now know consists in a fixed pattern of causal communications between its parts. Presumably, this pattern has an efficient cause, which is the interactions between its component parts. And based on that view about definition, should explain how the thing is generated through an efficient cause, the definition affirms or posits the thing's essence, insofar as the definition describes how the thing with that essence is generated through the efficient cause, i.e., through the interaction between its parts. And Spinoza seems to think that when we take a look at the pattern itself, which is generated by the interaction between its parts, we should find nothing in it. What we can find in it are only its cause of generation, rather than its cause of destruction. So he thinks that since the interactions between the component parts of an individual, which is described by the definition, is only generates the thing and not destroy the thing. So that is what he means here. All right. So now that we are somewhat clearer about what Spinoza means here, and the charge about obscurity is answered to a certain extent, the charge about question begging still lingers, because Spinoza here is essentially making the implicit assumption that the fixed pattern of causal communications, which individuates a thing, it can only be stable and sustainable and not self-destructive. And if Spinoza does not have any independent basis for making that assumption, he would indeed be begging the question really flagrantly. So what could be Spinoza's basis for that assumption? One common source of that basis could be our common sense intuition. But that particular principle of individuation as a sustainable pattern of causal communications does not really fit very well with our intuitions. Of course, conform to some of our intuitions. For example, our intuition about how me and Zoya the tiger do not form an individual. But on the other hand, it violates some of our other intuitions. For example, the suicidal Seneca, and this candle is burning itself down, and or some kind of clever mechanism that is designed to undermine itself. We would intuitively think these things count as genuine individuals. But according to this principle of individuation, they would be more like the aggregate of me and Zoya, tiger, and rather than genuine individuals. So this principle of individuation is revisionary. Does Spinoza has any independent basis for accepting this revisionary principle of individuation? I think he does. I think his basis come from his contemporary science, especially Huygens studies on the pendulums. Now, there's no question that Spinoza and Huygens knew each other. They were both living in the Netherlands and visited each other pretty frequently. And Huygens was telling everybody around him what he was doing. So there was no question that Spinoza knew what Huygens was doing. And what makes Huygens famous was his invention of the pendulum clock. the pendulum, as we know, has a property that it will forever carry on the same pattern or period of oscillations, where there should be no external obstacles. And what Huygens did was adding the pendulum to a clock. Now this picture might look somewhat familiar to you because it was on the first slide. And it shows a side view of the pendulum clock. On the utmost right, we see the pendulum hung by the rod. And everything on the left is more or less a conventional design of the clock. And what Huygens did was coming up with a very clever mechanism by which he made the movements of the clock conform to the oscillations of the pendulum. And by that, he thinks that clock will forever be in the same rhythm where there to be no external obstacle. And indeed, that was a very big success. Before Huygens, the most accurate clock deviates somewhat around 15 minutes per day, and the pendulum clock only deviates 15 seconds per day. Several years later, Huygens discovered what is now commonly called the synchronization phenomenon. What he found was that two pendulums or pendulum clocks come from the same beam would beat in the same rhythm. And they would even restore their synchrony after being interfered with. So this little drawing is by Huygens' own hands. And Huygens' explanation of that, as was perhaps obvious to any mechanically minded philosopher, was that the pendulums and the beam form a kind of interconnected system, and mechanical forces or motions were transmitted in that system so that that same pattern of synchrony is sustained. Now, what Spinoza could have learned from all these? First, we think that the pendulum is an individual. And we think that the air around the pendulum or my hand touching the pendulum do not count as the same individual of the pendulum as the pendulum. So what is the principle that explains all this? And presumably the principle that individuates the pendulum and distinguishes it from external factors was an sustainable pattern of oscillations, because the pendulum itself will forever keep the same pattern, and the air and my hand will only disrupt it. So that is the reason why the pendulum. That is the reason by which we individuate the pendulum. That is also confirmed by the fact that geometrical studies on the nature of pendulums only focus on that sustainable pattern. And in geometrically studying pendulum, we exclude the air friction, for example, our hands from the pendulum, and we only study that sustainable pattern in itself. And this is indeed how Huygens does things in his groundbreaking mathematical treatment on the oscillation on the pendulum clock. And that was a huge hit as well in European academia. So Spinoza, as you might know, Spinoza values geometrical knowledge a lot. He thinks geometrical knowledge is to be preferred to our common sense. So insofar as this model of individuation based on the pendulum is geometrical, perhaps Spinoza thinks that it takes precedence over our common sense intuition. And consequently, he thinks that it can and should be generalized to understand all individuals in general. And so all individuals whatsoever are individuated by a sustainable pattern of causal communications. And if we think about that, then we can have an explanation of all those apparently self-destroying things. Take, for example, the case of the suicidal Seneca. According to the pendulum model, the suicidal Seneca would be just like a pendulum that appears to stop on its own. So assume there's a pendulum hanging in this room right now, and someone sees that the pendulum gradually stopped oscillating and says, oh, this pendulum just stopped oscillating on its own. So what we should say to this person in response? we perhaps would say that this is more or less a description based on common sense, but this is inexact. If you are viewing the matter more exactly, you will see that the pendulum itself only consists in a sustainable pattern of oscillation, and all its stopping is only due to external factors, although they are not observed by you. And if you separate these external factors, find the pendulum does not stop or disrupt its own pattern. And Seneca's suicide would be just like that. His suicide would be only apparent, and because suppose someone says, "Oh, Seneca was killing himself," what we say in response was that your saying was also inexact. You are confusing external influences with Seneca himself, and only based on that confusion you are saying Seneca is killing himself. And if we separate those external factors from Seneca's essence itself, we'll see that Seneca's essence is only consists only in a sustainable pattern of causal communications. And accordingly, a proper or geometrical understanding of Seneca's essence is only concerned with Seneca's essence in itself, or the sustainable pattern. And when we understand Seneca's essence, we understand it. Right, so now I've finished arguing for my interpretation of E3P4, and here's a recap of my main claims. So my interpretation, the summary of my interpretation is that first, the thing in E3P4 refers to a composite individual, made up of component parts united with each other. My second claim is that the essence of that composite individual consists in the fixed pattern of causal communications between its component parts, and its destruction only consists in this the destruction of that pattern. My second claim is that the essence posits the thing's essence by describing the essence of the pattern is generated, and the thing not itself as the pattern is generated. So far, I have only answered the challenge raised by the case of suicide, which is on the essentiality requirement. But it seems that based on my interpretation, the concern about the universality requirements for how things like tables or stones strive for self-preservation can be answered as well. This is because the whole passage about Conatus is only concerned with this fixed pattern of causal communications, and which belongs to every individual thing, and regardless of its complexity. So there is no distinction of kind between human beings, animals, and other more ordinary and simpler objects. And although here I only talked about the impossibility of suicide, my interpretation also provides a more naturalistic way of understanding the striving for self-preservation. So we see that the essence of each individual thing consists in a pattern of causal communications, which is apparently a dynamic, so it could respond to external causes and external stimuli, and in reacting to the external causes, they would react in a way that tends to preserve the pattern as before. Interestingly, the political nature of striving can also be better understood. Spinoza thinks that we by nature strive to associate ourselves with other human beings, or in other words, we by nature strive to form with other human beings into a city-state, commonwealth. And now, with this more naturalistic model, we can see that this political nature of the striving can be understood as a feature of the pattern, just like in that system of interconnected pendulums, when different pendulums are interconnected into a larger whole, each pendulum could also preserve their own pattern. All right, so this finished my talk today. Thank you very much.
Okay, so for people on Zoom, we're going to follow our usual procedure. We'll be alternating between graduate students and faculty so far as possible. And Luke will be reading out questions from the chat for the people on Zoom. So if you're on Zoom and have a question, please put it into the chat.
All right, so this is a question from Shannon Abelson. Can you say a bit more about what kinds of influences on Spinoza's account can cause an interference in this causal chain leading to an agent's suicide? In other words, where does the failure/weakness occur? Presumably, Spinoza has a determinist story for this.
Can you repeat the last part of the?
Where does the failure/weakness occur? Presumably, Spinoza has a determinist story for this.
Yeah, first of all, about that, the weakness is more of a descriptive, descriptive claim about a feature of that particular system that is, it do not have any, it is not has enough power to sustain itself, and it does not have within itself any normative, elements. And that's what the weakness contains in it. Presumably, if you build up a system, physical system that is robust enough, it can, resist external interferences, but there are other physical systems that you can destroy easily, then that is what the weakness consists in. And I think, yeah, that's the whole theory, also deterministic and even necessitarian, and there is no undetermined causes, and everything is determined to happen this. So if you are weak, you are determined to be weak. You are not, ultimately there you are not animal. You are not, you don't have any fault, but it's just. And as for the destruction, I remember that you also asked about how has Spinoza had any good explanation for the interference. To be honest, Spinoza does not, and because he does not have a very developed physical theory, and that would have to be explained there. But Spinoza died before he, had the time to do so. He only gives us the very general description about this. Is in the physical digression how this whole pattern defines the individuality of the thing, and sometimes, there are external impacts that can destroy that whole system. That's he only as far as that general description.
Thank you so much for the talk. It made me wish I had Spinoza's text in front of me, but I just had a clarificatory question. I wondered if you could say a little bit more. It seemed very intriguing trying to explicate human agency in terms of the pendulum. And you said, what Conatus's argument says applies to every individual essence or fixed pattern of causal communications. But can you say a little bit more about how the explanation would scale up when we get much more complexity? I mean, I realize Spinoza's pushing against sort of common sense, but I guess flat-footedly, when we think about a biological organism like a human that's somewhat more complicated, I take it we think different impulses, different mechanisms kind of pushing it in different directions, right? We take it like just stepping away from Spinoza. You might sort of think intuitively if someone was suicidal, the anguish part of their soul seeks to die, but maybe other sort of mechanisms are self-sustaining in different ways. So there's this internal tension with a much more complicated organism like a human that we don't get with a pendulum.
Right.
So I was just wondering if you could explain, not just when we get more complexity, but when we get a system in which we have different systems sort of with conflicting prerogatives, perhaps.
Thanks. That's a very fair question. And the simple answer to that is Spinoza does not accept any difference except of a difference of complexity. That he does not think that by adding up complexity of system, you get some emergent properties, you suddenly get agents. He does not think that, and he reduces everything ultimately to the interaction between particles. That is what is where his mechanical philosophy is ultimately based. And right, I mean that can sound counterintuitive, but again, that is what other philosophers used to think back then, especially under the influence of new sciences, because we do not seem to have anything better back then, right? Because what they had was first Aristotelian philosophy, which perhaps can justify our just can perhaps better explain human agency better, but that whole thing seems pretty obsolete back then for them. They think that form is just something incomprehensible, and our incorporeal things are just exist, and so for them the best explanation is based on this physical based on this physical model. And there's also apparently a huge step to take from the basic interaction between particles to how humans are connected with, but that's kind of a leap of faith actually. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I find these microphones very awkward, but is this an appropriate volume? Okay, no one is complaining. So I like your account a lot, and the only thing that troubles me is that I'm finding it hard to find it in the demonstration itself. So this is your P4. And I guess the thing that I'm particularly having a hard time finding in the demonstration itself is this sort of notion of a sort of self-sustaining system that I think is really crucial to your account.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you can either help me find that notion in the demonstration itself, or just help me feel better about it not being explicit in the demonstration.
That's very fair, and thank you. I think that Spinoza admittedly does not do a very good job, presenting himself. So I'm, starting on the assumption that there, if we do not think Spinoza is just being stupid, then we have to think that there must be something else to it. And the thing there, I mean, presumably refers to an individual, and he has another explanation of the essence of the individual, which contains which consists in this pattern of communication between its parts. So that's what kind of connects the dots here. And I think the most solid evidence for that, in fact, comes from the next proposition that I explained on page 4 and not page 4, page 3 of the handout. So there, I think the Spinoza's use of the notion agreement and subject is a pretty, based on the historical evidence that I presented, is a pretty solid evidence that's showing that subject for a thing is a composite individual. And accordingly, we should, look for what Spinoza says about individual. And so the rest of the, interpretation kind of follows from that.
Yeah, so oh God, that was loud. I feel comfortable with that. I'm part of your account. The thing that I'm just a little bit more worried about is this is now the sort of pattern and pendulum stuff that Matthew was asking you about also, where it looks like that sort of idea that any given thing should be a self-sustaining system in a certain kind of way. It looks like it's surprising to me that that's not made explicit in the definition, in the demonstration, if it's so crucial to the success of the demonstration, and maybe especially surprising given that it's sort of based on new science. So that was the part I was hoping you could speak to a little bit more.
Right. Yeah, I do have a separate historical evidence for that, and I did not include this in the presentation because I thought it would take up more time perhaps, but that evidence is a letter that Spinoza wrote to Henry Oldenburg, the secretary of the Royal Society. And there, in the previous letter, Henry Oldenburg asked Spinoza to explain what the nature of the whole consists in. And Spinoza said that the nature of the whole consists, things constitute the whole insofar as the nature of the parts adapt to the pattern of the whole. And that what is important and interesting about that letter is that it was written only 9 months after Huygens' discovery that synchronization phenomenon. So it is very possible that Spinoza was inspired by not only Huygens' works on pendulum in general, but also Huygens' discovery of the synchronization phenomenon, where the sustainability of the pattern or the system is even clearer than the case of a single pendulum. And I think, and there's this Spinoza's not only use the word agreement, but you thinks that the parts could adapt, to the and adapt to the pattern of the whole. And I think that's an actual evidence. And I think, yeah, it's fair to say it might not seem adequate still, but here I might do a little too colloquial argument, because on the other interpretation, which is Dongaris, makes a lot of extra assumptions as well. He is saying Spinoza here is assuming that finite modes are just like gods, that they are like quasi-gods. And since gods are causa sui, cause itself, everything is causa of self to extent. And that interpretation is also not very, founded in the text of that demonstration. So yeah, I think on the one hand, if you are really trying to look for what is contained in that demonstration itself, you'll find very little. And so and you cannot make sense of it, but and you have to start look elsewhere, and then you might have some written doubt about whether that thing holds up. Yeah.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. I also really enjoyed this talk. In a way, my question is sort of following up on Matthew's. I'm wondering, do you think Spinoza can, I mean, he's writing in the 17th century, but could he accommodate, real living unities that are themselves embedded in larger complexes and are, in effect programmed to contribute to the life of the, so cells are living entities, and yet in some cases they're programmed to die in order to promote the health of the organism. And then you have things like social organisms that are embedded in complex ways. Does he have any familiarity with anything like that? And what would he say about it? How would he accommodate that?
Excellent. Let me get to that letter I just talked about here. There, Spinoza used a very famous analogy with a worm in the blood. So that worm in the blood, presumably the invention of telescope was sort of thing. Remember, Leeuwenhoek was in Netherlands as well, and he discovered there are minute little worlds, embedded with their feathers. So Spinoza was influenced by that, and he let us actually imagine that they are the little worm in our blood. And he thinks that there are two ways to think about that worm. On the one hand, we can think that worm as a whole in itself. So as a whole in itself, it is a sustainable pattern that is, that strives to preserve itself. But also he thinks that we can think about the worm as the part of the whole organism, that is the human body. And he thinks that insofar as it is a part of the human body, it can be programmed to die, and that does not interfere with the preservation of the larger organism. And so the point is that there are Spinoza thinks that there are different extents or different perspectives from which we can view the same thing, and we can see that thing as this an independent whole or something in itself, and also we can also view it insofar as it is a part of a larger thing. So we are seeing the same thing from these different perspectives, and the same thing cannot destroy itself insofar as it will hold itself, but in the second case, it is not destroyed by itself. It's destroyed by this. It is not destroyed because it is a destruction and contributes to the preservation of the whole organism. So the identity or the individuality kind of disappears in this larger organism. So there are different ways to think about the same thing. Oh, that, yeah.
Okay, thanks. I think I'll leave it at that, but I do worry that it trivializes the claim because in reality, nothing exists in isolation in this way. It's always in an embedded context. But I think I'll pass. Thanks.
Sorry. Excuse me? Oh, never mind. Sorry, put this on. Yeah, sorry, this is building off of Tim's worry. My worry is that it looks like on this view, no living organism is an individual. Right? I take it any living organism, not just worms, but Seneca, cows, it's left on its own. With if it were the only thing, no external forces impinging, it will die quite
Right.
quickly.
Spinoza
Right.
says that explicitly.
Hmm?
Spinoza actually says that explicitly.
But that's something internal. That's
Yeah,
not
right.
disruption from some internal, external force.
Right.
And this is perfectly general. So if the conclusion were that, so first my question is, does any living organism qualify as an individual? If the answer is no, then this can't be an argument about suicide, though, because suicide is about death, right? Only living organisms can die. Only living things can die. Right, so it can be a claim about suicide. Right, it might be a prohibition against the self-destruction of true individuals, but it would turn out no true individual, or no living thing was a true individual in this sense. So this wouldn't be about suicide. So,
Yeah, I kind of see two interconnected claims, and perhaps I'm misunderstanding you. The first one is about the meaning of death. You are saying only living things can die. The second one is about whether anything kind of is an individual.
but yeah, the more basic, I guess, is just are living any living organisms individuals?
Yeah, right. I think that's
The Seneca hypothesis.
great. That's a very, very good question. And I tend to think that there's some inconsistency in how in Spinoza. Because on the one hand, Spinoza does say that it is possible for everything to, destroy itself. And also he has this very peculiar passage about the free man, how the free man is always active and, does all sorts of things that only experiences its own nature. On the other hand, like I said, he does say that, no human beings, when they are completely separated from external things, will die. So they depend on external things in order to exist. So yeah, that's also worry that if anything, are individuals. I think, other than we do not want to charge Spinoza of inconsistency, we might say that different things perhaps embody these patterns to different degrees, and there are degrees in which these patterns are actually there. So nothing actually embodies this perfectly self-sustainable pattern in reality, because everything is influenced by external forces, and they are also influenced by external forces to different degrees. So that this is a discussion really only on this perfect pattern in itself, just like the Freeman passage. Of course, that kind of causes worry about how to what extent is this really applicable to the real world. I think Spinoza would say that this helped us understand the real world insofar as constitutes some kind of model against which we understand things. So we think ideally things have this striving for self-preservation. It's a similar pattern, and there are things that does not conform to that, but we still understand things against that.
But sorry, very quickly. Yeah. But that doesn't rule out that Seneca committed suicide. It would just entail that Seneca was not an ideal, perfect.
Right.
And whoever thought he,
Right.
Then the
Yeah.
conclusion, I think,
Yeah. Yeah, I think his answer will be something like this. If you are saying, I think we discussed this over dinner last night, but I will say again, so that if you are saying that the actor and the one acted upon are absolutely the same thing, then you are saying that Spinoza would say, you are not distinguishing between different things appropriately, right? Even if Seneca, even if no pattern in reality, embodies that kind of perfect sustainable pattern, it is still, made up, of things or to different extents. And when you are saying Seneca, the actor and the one acted upon is the same one, so you are making the legitimate move of confusing what's what the one that is acting that acted upon. Of course, yeah, I'm not because in a way I don't want to say this is Spinoza's problem, and I think that is a justified worry about that. And on the other hand, I do not see any perhaps another way to make this demonstration work in order to respond to your worry. Yeah. So perhaps I'll think more about this. Yeah.
Well, I had really the same worry, and isn't it a big worry for Spinoza because it means that Proposition 4 in Book 3 doesn't really support the drive for self-preservation in human beings, and so just undercuts all the rest of the work in the ethics if that's really essential. And so the postulate that we all strive for self-preservation becomes a kind of maybe approximately true contingent empirical claim rather than something founded on an a priori principle. So it seems to me that's a real sort of worry about this way of making good on the proof for that proposition. I had a slightly different question I wanted to ask. So we're supposed to have the idea that the essence is a pattern that is self-sustaining, but of course the thing can have properties which are not essential properties. You have accidents, and so why can't an accident that a thing has lead to a disruption of the pattern without any external cause?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. And that, I think my reply to you, and I also reply to David. I came upon it when I was listening to your question actually. So that pattern itself, yeah, because in the real world, everything is influencing every other thing constantly. So even if that pattern in perfect form would be a self-sustainable one, it is also constantly being influenced by external things, and whatever is caused there does not belong to its own nature. They kind of diminish that pattern to a certain extent. So what really exists there are this compromise pattern that is fails to approximate that ideal or that perfect form of the pattern properly. And the answer to David's question would be that you have to consider the patterns themselves. And if you are saying that Seneca himself kills himself, then if you are saying that, if it is this imperfect pattern that causes its own destruction, you are not, seeing things exactly, because what causes this pattern to be inexact is an external cause. So you are in a way also confusing what is external to the internal way. And that I think that kind of also answers your question.
But something David also said, which I think is right, is that the model is you have a closed system with a pattern which sustains itself. Then you got something with an essence. But we're not like this. We have to interact with the environment in order to continue to sustain ourselves. Yeah. So if we were closed systems, we would, as David said, die very quickly. So we're just not the kind of systems that a pendulum is, an oscillating pendulum, which is a closed system. It will continue to oscillate forever as a closed system with no external interaction, but we're not like that.
Right. Thanks.
That goes back to Tim's
Yeah,
point
yeah.
that we're part of an ecosystem and
Uh-huh.
we're designed to interact with things around us in order to sustain it.
Yeah, thanks. Spinoza would say, we are not, you're saying that we're not perfect system because you are relying on common sense perhaps too much. That's it's more or less valid observation that, human beings must eat, must drink in order to stay alive. But that is a more or less a commonsensical, observation. And Spinoza is saying that, that because if you know about Spinoza's theory of knowledge, there are different kinds of knowledge. Spinoza, common sense or conceptual knowledge is the lowest of them. And the exact or the true knowledge about things has to be geometrical or even intuitive in a sense. So it has this higher kind of knowledge. So Spinoza would say, your view is only a commonsensical view, but we have this awesome geometrical model of understanding things. It's based on pendulums, and we should prioritize that.
Well, but let me grant, that we'll say something is a thing with an essence only if it were a closed system, it would have a pattern that would be self-sustaining indefinitely and hence could not destroy itself. I mean, just definitional in that case. But then there's a further plane that has to be established in order to use that and to say anything about human beings. And that is that we're systems of that sort. And is there an a priori argument for that? Is it an empirical argument? So it opens up an argumentative gap somewhere else. And it's a big one. And it looks like it's going to be because the conclusion is false. It's not going to be a valid argument or sound argument.
Yeah, I see where that comes from. And yeah, in a sense, I mean, I must stuck with the caveat and I'm not, it's not me that arguing, saying I'm just a spokesperson of Spinoza that I'm trying to be. So Spinoza would say, and again, this is you are starting from perceptual knowledge. So the very assumption that human beings are not whole systems, it's a empirical.
Spinoza knew that as well. I mean, Spinoza knew that as well, right? And so these things that I'm saying are things that would have been also common knowledge at the time, and Spinoza would have known these things as well. So, you might think maybe charity suggests we look a little bit further to see whether there's a way of sustaining for, and also the link he wants to give human beings being having as part of their essence self-preservation.
Okay, so can you hear me?
Yeah.
I apologize. I have a similar line of worry, but I'd like to develop it differently. So let's go with the idea that Spinoza thinks he sees more clearly into the nature of reality than ordinary talk can. And he's got this view of how to think about what things are. So he's a super metaphysician of a kind. And then, so Kirk raised the problem, so did David and several others. How does this map onto the way we ordinarily think about things and talk about them? And what you said about his view, that he's got a rather low opinion of common sense, got me thinking. So here's one way, perhaps. I want to see, this is speculative. I want to see whether you think it might map on to the way Spinoza is thinking. That we interpret common sense as a sort of guide to reality. So we think of humans as individuals in this basic way. We have a kind of metaphysical reading of common sense, ordinarily, you might think. And this is where our confusion lies, because we're thinking of them as these things that can kill themselves. But if you follow his geometrical reasoning and scientifically informed conception of what a thing can be, the way metaphysicians, would want to do, and the way he apparently does, there has to be confusion in this common sense way of thinking, at least to the extent of it regarding, say, Seneca as a basic thing. So we face, there's two kinds of criticism. I mean, the main criticism here is it has nothing to do with what we say when we say Seneca killed himself. But here's a way of connecting. We are naturally inclined to give a metaphysical reading to this, like Kripke would, there are these basic individuals. Nixon might have lost the election, that kind of thing. And if Spinoza is right, that's a mistake. And so he might be forcing us to think about it in that way. I'm just speculating. Otherwise, I do see the problem pretty serious for him that if he hasn't a mapping onto common sense, then it doesn't seem like he's speaking to us at all, period. And so here's a way I was just suggesting. I don't know if that makes any sense to you as a reading Spinoza.
Yeah, thanks. It definitely appeals to me, and I think that's a reasonable reading of Spinoza. That by going into the second the geometrical knowledge, we can clarify the common sense metaphysics. I think that's fair, and I tend to agree with that. The thing is that it does not really match up with Spinoza's text pretty well, because he thinks that perceptual knowledge are in a sense inherently confused. We cannot really the difference between that and geometrical knowledge is a difference in kind. We cannot really use that to clarify common sense, and so either you just stick with geometrical knowledge and do away with common sense and perceptual knowledge altogether, or you are forever trapped in this views.
But look, he uses the word suicide in his text, right? So he must be either he's giving that a metaphysical reading or he's engaging with common sense.
Yeah,
I don't know what's going on there even on your reading.
right. Yes. So I guess you're right. So based on that more geometrical model of individuals, the suicide can be clarified, right, as the conflict between different individuals. So that's the kind of clarification of the commonsensical knowledge. That's good. Yeah, right. I think that's fair. And the main worry still is that as far as great as that claim by itself goes, Spinoza's own concept view, on epistemology is quite the counter. And it's quite possible that Spinoza is not consistent. And it is possible to read more past something that could appeal to our philosophical sense more. I think that's one way to go. And also it's possible that Spinoza himself didn't quite figure out how to put things together. Thanks.
Oh, I wonder if I can change direction a little bit now. And maybe I was just thinking it would help me to understand Spinoza's position if you could give a positive characterization. How would he describe what's going on in what we would call a paradigm act of suicide? So I take the dagger and I stab it into my heart and I die. So it's true, and if your argument succeeds, suicide is impossible. Then what? How would those acts be positively characterized?
Right.
Would Spinoza say, "I'm using an external object, and that external"? I think it would help me to sort of see. Yeah, if you could explain if we know that suicide isn't what's going on, what is going on there?
Yeah, thank you. So the commonsensical description of that is that you killed yourself, and perhaps this chunk of matter in mind perhaps causes its own destruction. That's the commonsensical description. And Spinoza is saying that what we think as one thing is in fact perhaps aggregate of different individuals. Perhaps you only kill yourself under no obvious external pressure or compulsion, because you your mind perhaps is so influenced by external causes that it do not belong to the same individual. So what we are seeing as the same matter are in fact different, made up of different individuals and not one same individual. So perhaps your mind, within your mind, there's something that is causing your stabbing yourself, and that individual is different from the individual that is killed. So it is so the subject and the object of the verb kill cannot be the same, under the most exact description.
Static identity. Yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
So that got me thinking about other kinds of cases. So, common sense, suicide is someone intending and successfully doing something that results in that person's death. But, I can also walk off the edge of the cliff while I'm thinking about Spinoza, and that's way of causing my death. And what about the case of, cancer, where your own cells sort of go haywire?
That's a perhaps easier thing to explain that Matthew's case. So the tumor would not belong to the same thing. It would not constitute the same individual as the rest of the body, where it is the tumor is something, even if spatially or spatially speaking, it is located here. It does not make up the same individual with the rest of you, and it is this part of you that is destroying the rest of you. And it's not. Yeah, it's a complex between different features.
Well, I don't know. So one could just make it definitional, right? We'll just say it's not a part of you if it's a part of you that leads to your own destruction, as it were. I mean, but it's your cell, right? And the cell goes haywire. Now suddenly the cell not a part of you.
I didn't hear exactly. Can you speak to the?
Yes, sorry. Suddenly I feel more powerful. Yeah, so the weird thing about cancer is that it's not something outside you that attacks you, it's your own body that attacks you, right? They are your cells.
Yeah, right.
And yeah. So I mean, it does seem to be. I mean, this in a way is going to go back to the earlier theme about whether we turn out to have essences at all. But it does seem that when you think of us, we're composites, and at a certain level of description, we consist of a collection of cells that interact with each other. There's a sort of pattern there that sustains life and so on. And those things that are elements in the network look like they should be counted as part of us. But then, of course, those things can, turn out to go haywire and start multiplying in a way that eventually leads to your own death. And it sounded like your move was going to be a sort of definitional one. Well, we're just not going to count that as part of you because it would it would contradict the claim. And it seems, ad hoc, and it makes it, kind of puzzling to think about what you are.
Right.
Because
right.
all those cells are potentially something to go haywire. So
Thank you. So yeah, that is what I meant when I talked about a little bit in the talk, that this principle individuation violates our intuitions. For with intuitive everything, the tumor is the same individual as you, and you're kind of doing so. There's and Spinoza, he is not taking that intuitive. He is not taking intuitions to be valid, because he has this. He thinks that we're only entitled to accept this principle individuation based on a scientific understanding of things, and which posits that the pattern that individualism must be sustainable. And so that's the main thought there, and he uses that to revise, come up with a bit more revisionary in the physics. And it might be sound a bit reason might be too weak for you, but still the importance of geometrical knowledge for Spinoza, I mean, is huge. And he does insofar as the pendulum or the closed systems are the only thing upon that he can get, about a physical knowledge, physical system that is geometrically, explained, that has constituted a lot of everything.
Can I come back to the question I had earlier about whether an accident of someone could lead to the disruption of the pattern, which is the person's essence or thing's essence? Did you answer that earlier? Because I thought maybe you got sidetracked in responding to the David's question.
Yeah, the accident, right. So I personally do not think insofar as we are thinking about individual things in Spinoza, that inherence model is the right way to go, perhaps. Perhaps for Spinoza, it is all things are more or less compositional. So it's modes interacting with each other, and it is flattened out in a sense. So there's no this different level of substance, accidents. So what causes the destruction of a pattern is only the impact from another thing on the same level. So it's not an accident that's causing the destruction of its subject or substance, but rather just like two colliding bodies, this body sets up the motion of another body or alters its direction. And it is, I think, in the same way that Spinoza thinks about the sense in which we are destroyed, i.e. there are external forces that impinge on us and disrupts our path.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm still trying to get this. But so what about a pendulum that has, it's got a rod connected to a weight, and the rod is actually pretty weak, but it can hold up the weight for, like, say 2,000 swings. After that, the weight falls off. This is internal to the pendulum. If there's, even in a vacuum, the weight's going to fall off.
Right. In that case,
That would be an accident of, this would be an example of Kirk's case.
right. The thing to say in response, perhaps we would have to look at, the actual geometrical treatment of pendulum. So Huygens made this very specific, the specification of what he is treating. He is treating a pendulum that is a weight that is hanged from a line that doesn't, the idealized line that does not have does not have a mass, does not have a magnitude. So that is his more ideal, more geometrical way of treating things.
So, okay, great. So it's not a real pendulum. So this made me think of it. This made me think of another. Goes right into the second thing I wanted to say. So some of this sounds to me like, sorry to bring up more contemporary philosophers, but Peter Unger saying nothing is flat. So, there are two kinds of philosophizing you could do here. You could say, let's find out what people mean by flat and look at the things they call flat and assume, okay, those are flat. So we'll investigate a generalization from that. And then there's Unger and others like him who say, no, look, flat is a concept, and it's really an open question whether anything is flat. And so you could have an error theory where people go around thinking things are flat. That's an interpretation of the common sense, but they're just wrong. And it seems to me that this is a way of reading Spinoza here. So it goes back to what I was saying before, that he thinks somehow built into the way we ordinarily think is this sloppy assumption that human beings are things. And so when these non-things, end up dead because various things happen that we would describe as they're killing themselves, we're just confused. And it's just like saying, I think my desk is flat, but poor slob, I haven't thought it through properly. actually, nothing is flat. So my desk is not flat. Does this seem like in the ballpark of a way out? I mean, I'm just struggling to find, otherwise he sounds like a nut. Really, unless we find some way of connecting the geometry with what we know to be, what we believe to be true of the world. Right? That's too strong. He sounds very odd.
Fine. Yeah, thanks. Right, thank you. So the group of questions that you have just, asked are really pertinent because the thing with this Conatus argument and Spinoza's model of individual in general is that it is supposed to be in itself something, either self-sustainable but in real also Spinoza has this view about how everything in reality does not really live up to that. In a sense, I mean, what you said is very pretty relevant. Spinoza would say, common sense is it's a dead end. We cannot, understand things properly with that, and we should start with the first cause of things, and by to understand things from causes, and geometry constitutes the model for him, because for him, geometry studies the causation. That's pretty weird, I know, but it is one of the common views back then, and it's things study geometry is about particles in motion, and colliding each other, and the laws of motion are kind of derived geometrically, and Spinoza was quite influenced by that. And Spinoza saying that if we go from the causes, we see what the bodies can do, what the system can do. And we find this notion of sustainable system. And then we only cast our eyes to the real world. Perhaps we will find things that do not come from that idea, but still we have to do more explanation in order to make it. So for example, perhaps the pattern that is actually here, perhaps it is in itself, ideally a pattern that's self-sustainable, but perhaps it's influenced by external causes. So he divided more and more explanations in order to account to accommodate for that more geometrical vision of things. I don't know if that makes sense.
Sorry, this is really kind of a variant of what Gary just said, but it seems to me. Well, I'm curious how sort of ultimately Platonistic this has to be. That is, in the case of the pendulum. So try to think of a closed, self-sustaining system that counts as a real individual. And I take it the example here is pendulum, right? And I take it even without it breaking, any real pendulum will not swing forever, right? Simply because of friction. And friction is something internal. Yeah. And that's internal to the system. And that the only way you get to the infinitely swinging pendulum is by abstracting away from precisely the characteristics that make it a real thing, right? And just representing it abstractly in terms of the and so does that mean that the only real individuals here, that have essences, self-sustain, essentially have to be something like abstracted like that? Like not things that can have real properties, real locations in time and space. Is that where Spinoza's headed? And then that would rule out scientific.
Yeah, in a sense, I mean, I would agree with that. And also, there's this very, kind of famous and comment about, how common philosophers are doing philosophy in the wrong way because they're starting from intuition and tries to see, what are behind intuition. Spinoza is saying that they are doing philosophy in the wrong way. Rather, we start from the other way around, i.e. from the causes that justify theory. And if we are understanding things in this way, then it is not by starting from the concrete model and then abstracting the friction. It is by first having this model and then seeing the fraction that is something added onto it. And so it is we have the work we are doing is excluding an interference that is not there. So it is not kind of abstraction, but rather starting from the right vision of things and seeing that in things.
Thank you, Tim. So I'm thinking about the generalization from the case of the pendulum, but in a slightly different aspect of that than what's been discussed. It looks as though, given how he's understanding what's going on in the case of the pendulum, the generalization should yield the claim, each thing as far as it can by its own power perseveres in its being. But that's not what he generalizes to. He generalizes to something weaker, if he is indeed generalizing, right? Because what the claim says is each thing as far as it can by its own power strives to persevere in its being. That's a weaker claim. So I'm wondering if you have any account of why, if this is the right way to understand what he's doing, he is generalizing from the case of the pendulum. Why does he generalize to the weaker rather than to the stronger claim?
The stronger claim being that
each thing as far as it can by its power perseveres in its being. Right? Something can strive to persevere in its being, but fail, right? So what he actually gives us is the weaker claim.
Right. Yeah. I'm trying to see. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And I think what you said is correct. That is, things can in fact fail to preserve their being. So what is pertains to their own nature is only this kind of tendency, from the precedent days of that pattern. It tends to follow from that the subsequent states of the pattern is still conforms to the same pattern. But it can happen, of course, that it is destroyed from the outside, and that is what is driving there is to do. It's kind of an inertia in the modern sense that it has this feature to a tendency to preserve and it can fail. It's just like the pendulum, and you can indeed go ahead.
In fact, the ideal case, we had a conception of the individual as being constituted by a pattern of causal communications that's stable and sustainable in itself. And it looks as though what you ought to conclude from that is that the thing, insofar as it can by its own power, perseveres in its being.
Right. Okay. I see where their problem is at. Yeah, it might be perhaps because of that, the particular way of translating things. That's by some power. It already is kind of striving for effort or some tendency. Something. The Latin there is quantum says. So it means that we're only taking a thing, taking at the pattern itself and not confusing external factors to it. And then we find that this pattern has the tendency to persevere in its being. So striving comes out there. And so this translated from Curly, and a lot of commentators have objected to that particularly. But I have to to follow Curly's translation. And yeah, sorry, also do that. I don't know if that clarifies.
I'm going to repeat something you just said. And that is that, so if it's a closed system and it's a thing with an essence, then it will preserve itself. But, most things are not closed systems. So do they preserve themselves? Well, no, the conclusion should be that things which are not closed systems strive to preserve themselves, I think is what you were saying, right? So that would explain why it's weaker. Well, it doesn't answer the question whether we actually are such things that if we're closed systems, we preserve ourselves.
To say a simple thing. I worry that won't do the trick in the political philosophy. Because in the political philosophy, among other things, you need something like the scribes to, if you're going to explain why Spinoza thinks that all of the bad things that can happen such that we need a resolution to them. Right? Like in TMP or in the later sections of the ethics. Sorry.
Your question was that, is not enough for, accounting for all the actions in political philosophy. Is that correct? Your question? Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Mhm. Right. Right. But also, I see where that comes from. But in that way, every, the striving here perhaps cannot be read perhaps in a less naturalistic or perhaps more, psychological way, because that kind of muddies the whole picture, because the thing is supposedly applicable to every individual thing. And that has to come from the kind of naturalistic tendency or property of that thing that has. So I kind of like that. I like that, and I'm not sure whether that would cause any trouble in political philosophy. Like people like their peer group perhaps would develop a whole ethics of political philosophy based on this Marxist vision. And yeah, perhaps can you say more on what particular problems do you think cause?
At both toward the end of the ethics and certainly in different parts of TNP, Spinoza entertains the possibility that the striving of individuals in the ordinary language sense, people, the strivings of the individuals and the exercise of their powers, as he calls it there, can conflict in such a way that needs a resolution, right? But if you're just talking about, if all striving means there is tends to, then you're going to lose the sense in which there can be conflict. Particularly given the reading that you want of the political aspect.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a naturalistic way to think about the conflict, right? When the two bodies are colliding, one of them is tending to go this way, but not the other one is going to go that way. So that is a kind. Although there are no, striving other than the tendency there, it is still a kind of, conflict there. And also, it's resolving, just results necessarily from that precedent state. But I think Spinoza is okay that he is, he has to be. He is a necessitarian, so every state just follows from the other. The precedent ones.
Not exactly what I thought. I'm not quite sure the angle. Sorry, but this is, I think, really just getting back to that. In Spinoza's metaphysics, can he talk about mere tendencies or mere dispositions, where that would mean that, having a tendency to X doesn't entail that under suitable circumstances, the thing X is. Yeah. Or does, no, that just means insofar as the adequate circumstances are present, it access.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. So there's a controversial question. My answer to that is that he does not entertain pure potentiality in the sense of Aristotelian. So there's no purely unactualized potentiality. And that tendency is explicable in some kind of small actual, motion or action. And this is how, in fact, Hobbes interprets the notion of Conatus, striving or endeavor, which is kind of a tendency or potentiality, but it's also a very small actual motion. And I think Spinoza does not say explicitly on that, but say given his, that to Hobbes, I think it's possible that Spinoza is holding a similar way about tendency. That is, it is not pure potentiality, but it is something that is actual but small actuality, just like small motion. It's the beginning of motion. It is small motion and entails that, larger motion that is followed by it, that follows it, and but that tendency is the kind of the sprout. How that works. Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much.